Pariyatti Audiobooks presents Chapter 8, Unmeasured Time, from Journey of Insight Meditation by Eric Lerner, as read by Jonathan Nelson.
Chapter 8, Unmeasured Time. The entire island of Ceylon has only 8 million inhabitants, and as I stood idly waiting for a bus, or walked through the streets of Colombo, the capital city, I no longer felt the constant psychic assault that I had been aware of in India. The most obvious difference, however, was that Ceylon was a Buddhist country. Even the most casual conversation easily turned to a common appreciation of the Dharma. There are probably no more Ceylonese who actually practice the heart of Buddha's teachings than there are real practitioners of any religion anywhere. But everyone I met at least understood the value of his teachings and was willing to support those who really did wish to pursue them. The bus that took me out of Colombo was steamy hot. Uncomplaining people packed against each other, creating a vibrant heat, and intermittent rain kept the windows shut. Since my clothes were soaked with sweat anyway, I would have taken the rain over the heat. At least I had a seat, reserved for the clergy. This seemed appropriate, since I was on my way to check into a Buddhist monastery. It was nearly dark when the driver stopped the bus at a crossroads between two towns and pointed up a hill to the left. I got out, and he handed me my bag, wishing me good luck. A minute later, with my bag slung over my back like a pack, I set off on the dirt road. The trip hadn't been easy. Since my departure from Burma some 2 weeks ago, I'd traveled alone in a space of portable solitude. There had been sickness in India, a difficult moment of parting from my friends back in Calcutta, and now that my money had begun to evaporate, long journeys on cheap trains. All along this winding path from Calcutta to Ceylon, I'd had endless choices, endless routes to take, but at each crossroads, the right trail was marked perfectly clearly, if only to my eyes. On the way south to Ceylon, I had stopped in Pondicherry, an odd city on the southeast coast of India, once ruled by the French, to visit my cousin Rose, who had been in India for some time now as a member of a pioneer, utopian-type community known as Auroville, an offshoot of the ashram founded by Sri Aurobindo. The members of the community lived in beautiful, thatched houses with poured concrete floors. Fresh tropical fruit, whole wheat bread, cow's milk, nuts, and vegetables were their diet. Farming, building, and planning were their way of life. I spent about 3 days with my cousin Rose, following her around as she showed me other parts of the sprawling community. Amazing modern structures of concrete and steel rising up out of semi-desert, beautiful 2-story homes by the beach, artists at work, small schools. I listened to her own plans to build a new house and plant cash crops. One afternoon, Rose and I went for a long walk to the beach to visit some friends. Rose wasn't perfectly happy with the home she had, and one of the reasons she took me to see her friends was that their dwelling was a model for what she wanted. "Isn't it nice?" she kept asking me, unsure herself and worried about where the money to build a new house might come from. She accepted my silence, perhaps, as tacit approval. I was glad she didn't insist. I didn't know if I would be able to lie or to explain just what I felt. "Of course it's nice," I would have wanted to say, but nice doesn't matter. But how could I explain that "doesn't matter" was simply a verbal approximation of my reaction at that moment to those surroundings? The locus of reality had drawn so close to me that I could no longer even dare to say, "That over there is nice." The event, the actuality of what was happening right then, was not in this house, these surroundings. Reality was going on right inside me. The only event was my mind's reaction to whatever was around me. What made me so sure of this? In those long, open-ended hours in the cell, the evidence had become overwhelming that it was not what was out there, not even people, that made me suffer, made me glad. It was my mind. And my mind was not something I seemed to have any control over. Something automatic took place, like thunder after lightning. When I looked at the house Rose showed me, my mind's reaction sent my whole being into elation or disgust, or boredom or depression, or the zillion other variations that we call being alive. And that's why what happens out there assumes such huge importance. Because when there is no control over the automatic reaction, then the only thing to do is pick certain reactions that, at least for a time, are more comfortable, less painful. That becomes pleasure. But that pleasure is dependent on something out there happening a certain way, so that the automatic reaction will register pleasure. When one of the women Rose lived with told me that after a time I'd be back there too, since there was no better place to live, I smiled. Paradise wasn't what I was seeking, but I was glad I had stopped in to find that out. My cousin and her friends couldn't understand my rush to be on. I didn't either. But I knew that this was not what I was looking for, and that right then my attention seemed to be diving inward, seeking the source, the wellspring of the conditioning of my mind. There was nothing out there that I was willing to turn my attention to. It was a very different way of being that my life had evolved into. The life I had so recently led was based on thought and decision, and the rationale that preceded decision arose from a process that seemed unreliable to me now. I no longer trusted my thoughts, because they weren't me. The only thing recognizable enough for me to rely on now was an unspoken intuition about the very next move. Not its implications, its ramifications, or the results it would produce, but simply what I ought to do next. Now I was in Ceylon on my way to a monastery. I walked to the crest of a hill and looked out across a long, lush valley of cultivated fields. At the top of the far hill, I saw the spire of the pagoda. I reached the top of the hill and hastened down the other side into the rapidly darkening valley. It looked like I had a good walk ahead of me. The rain was starting up again and my clothes were pretty wet, but that was all right. The valley was one of the most beautiful places I had ever been anywhere in the world. It was a remarkable balance between human cultivation and the earth's desire to keep itself so thickly covered by vegetation that it would be protected from disturbances by man. So it appeared that the large tracts of rice fields and vegetable gardens were just on loan, while the abutting forests waited impatiently to reclaim their own. There was a vibrant energy to this land, unlike most of what I'd seen in India, where the earth had been beaten into submission for so many thousands of years that nothing grew there now without a struggle. In Ceylon, there was an easiness, a spontaneity to growth. The sun didn't set this close to the equator, it crashed, and the colors of purple evening hanging over the emerald fields were electric. Brown trails marked the edges of the fields, and wildflowers dotted the entire scene with hot hues of red and orange. A loinclothed farmer leaned on his hoe and smiled as I came up to him. "Aranya?" I asked, pointing up the hill. It was the old Buddhist word for a forest hermitage, I'd been told. "Aranya, Aranya," he nodded, happily gesturing onward. At the foot of the hill, a neat stone stairway marked the entrance to the monastery. When I got to the top, I stood at the edge of a large, open courtyard, catching my breath and looking at a group of monks waiting for me at the far end. Suddenly, I felt unsure about just how my request to stay and meditate would be received. What if they refused? There were no buses back to Colombo tonight. Only one other Westerner had ever stayed here for any length of time, and the American anthropologist who had told me about this place had not exactly been encouraging when I decided to come. I started preparing a number of introductory lines, all of which seemed to be amazingly long tangles of words. I could see their faces staring at me as I approached. They were smiling, and it occurred to me that I must look like a drowned rat. Were they smiling at my appearance? Almost before I realized it, I found myself facing an old, baby-faced monk on the porch of a small cottage. He was apparently the head monk. I dropped my bags, fell to my knees, and prostrated before him as he intoned his blessings in a somber but loving voice. When I looked up, I saw a twinkle in his eyes, and I had the amazing sensation that he had been waiting there for me in that seat and was saying, "Wonderful, you've finally arrived." He didn't speak a word of English, but a layman who was standing beside him spoke enough for me to let him know that I wished to stay here and do solitary meditation. As the news spread among the group of monks standing there, everyone seemed to be delighted. Then, after a while, an English-speaking monk was summoned from some far corner of the monastery. When the short, smiling, shy monk arrived, what everyone had already grasped was formalized into words. While others asked me how I'd gotten there, Nyayaka Mahatera, as the head monk was known, like a doting grandfather, saw to it that I got out of my wet clothes, had a proper bath, and was fed. When all this was accomplished, our translator, a bhikkhu, or monk, named Sunno, described the layout of the place. Spreading out from the central courtyard into the hills in all directions were numerous kutis, little cottages where one could live in varying degrees of seclusion. There were caves up on the cliffs, especially prepared for retreats. Mahatera barked orders to the younger monks, some of whom looked no more than 12, to get keys and lamps and collect some furniture. There was one place in particular that would be good for me, he said. It was a hut in the forest, all alone, with a stream below it, way on the other side of the hill. Unfortunately, it was occupied by a local school official who was here for a few days. Until he left, I could have the kuti where the anthropologist usually stayed, which was built into the rock at the top of a hill overlooking the monastery. The two monks led the way with lamps across the now dark courtyard and up long flights of rock steps till we arrived at a cleared, veranda-like area at the entrance to two caves. Natural rock formations had transformed them into little huts. Huge, overhanging stones served as roof and rear wall. Plaster and stone formed the front wall, which had a door and windows. The inside of the cave was smoothed over with plaster and whitewash. It was furnished with a little table, a chair, and a low rope bed with a mattress on which I spent an enormously restful night until I was awakened by the gong that roused the community at 4 a.m. Just after sunrise, I bathed in a spring-fed pool located conveniently in a deep niche in the rock just beside my kuti, and then stepped out onto the wide terrace overlooking the whole monastery. The structures of the monastery were built into and around the existing rock formations, so that even trees were left undisturbed. The cliffs were used as a natural buffer to whatever civilization was nearby. Looking down, I saw yellow-robed men intently sweeping their walkways with delicate brooms, while others busily gathered flowers for ceremonial offerings from lush, tended gardens. The day's work had commenced on a new teaching and instruction hall that was being built on the hill beneath the main courtyard. The work was personally overseen by Mahatera himself. As I descended the hill, I felt as if I was in some elfin workshop. Huts dotted the hill, housing monks busy at work or study, and chanting floated out of open windows. I caught a few smiles, but no one approached me with conversation. When I reached the inner court where the monks were fed, I was directed to a corner room. There I sat alone at a small, low table and feasted on delicious rice cakes mixed with milk, noodle pancakes, chutney, fruit, and coconut sweets with tea, the offerings of the lay people for the hermitage's inhabitants, all in quantities I couldn't hope to eat. This was how all my meals would be served, apart from the monks. I would be left entirely on my own. From the end of the noon meal until 7 the next morning, I would be all to myself in that small cave at the top of the hill. One day at 6 in the evening, there was a knock at the door of my cave. At first, I didn't respond. Then I remembered what it signified. Mahatera was requesting my presence. I followed 2 young monks down the hill and back to the end of the courtyard, to the little porch where Mahatera had sat on the evening of my arrival, and where he sat every morning for all the monks to receive his blessings and well-wishing. That was one ceremony I took part in. This evening, when, answering his summons, I prostrated before him, his smile seemed more gleeful than usual, even a little playful. Pointing to the red and white checkered lungi that I wore wrapped around my waist and my purple t-shirt, he shook his head. I didn't think I was that inappropriately dressed, but he had other ideas. With a dramatic flourish, he signaled to one of the younger monks, who handed me an old, neatly folded yellow lungi and a yellow dyed shirt. Mahatera motioned for me to go inside and put them on, and when I reappeared, he clapped his hands together and called several other monks to come over and see what he had produced. It wasn't full monk's garb, but the uniform for a layman living at the monastery. Quite pleased, Mahatera sent me back to my dwelling. After dark, I heard a lot of noise in the courtyard, and when I finally went out to see what was going on, the walkways below were lit up by rows of burning candles on long poles. Lights were on in the main hall, and I heard chanting. The next morning, when I walked down the hill to breakfast, I found the monastery filled with crowds of visiting laymen. The young man who had so graciously served me my meals was going to be ordained. My first impulse, after 3 days alone in my cave, was to run inside and bolt the door. But soon I was sitting in the large, cool, marble-floored hall among the friends and family of the young monk-to-be, facing Mahatera and 4 or 5 senior monks as they chanted their way through the ceremony. The ritual was austere but impressive. It was a rite of passage, the journey from one world to another. The young man left the hall dressed as I had been before Mahatera had given me my new clothes. He returned with his head shaved, dressed in yellow draped robes, identical to those of all his brothers, and so distinct from the clothes of those in the audience. Gone forth from home to homelessness is what the ceremony is called, the going forth. I looked around quickly at those who'd come to bid him goodbye from their world. I tried to gauge their reaction, but it wasn't visible. All I could think was that my mother would be appalled, and in some way I was, too, almost automatically. I was aware of the attitude toward monks of any sort that I had been brought up with, even my particular culture's attitude toward celibate Catholic priests. Something strange, unnatural about it. A man has got to be somewhat, have some sort of problem to want to live without a woman all his life, to want to live within walls. That was the picture. Walls were an escape, and a monk was somehow less than a man, someone who couldn't handle all of life. I smiled now at the lie. The young man's rite of passage was not a flight, but a conscious evolution. One of the older monks began to speak in Sinhalese. A layman, sitting beside me, explained that it was a lecture on the virtues of monastic life. I didn't get much more of a translation, so I got up quietly and left. Outside, there was a crowd of some 60 or 70 of the monastery's residents who had assembled for the ceremony. The beauty of their clear, shining faces was dazzling. There were some who had spent nearly their entire lives behind these walls, and yet their faces showed no signs of deprivation. Others, young men in their 20s, with the grace of swans, bore on their faces expressions of absolute unconcern. Assurance was molded into their being. All lived by endless rules in here. All had to dress the same way, eat the same thing at the same time, with the same kind of bowl, perform the same rituals, rise at the same hour, with absolutely no freedom except for the mind. Suddenly there was a tap on my shoulder. It was Bhikkhu Suno, who had translated for me on my arrival. He himself had only been here for a little more than 6 months. Before that, he had worked as an engineer in London, living the life most Ceylonese only dream about. Now he talked to me enthusiastically about his new life here. With a small group of fellow practitioners, he lived separate from the rest of the monks in the meditation section of the monastery, a self-enclosed community designed to provide even greater seclusion from distraction to those engaged in full-time meditation. I was surprised when he said that he only practiced meditation a few hours a day. When I told him about the kind of schedule that I had been taught, he nodded pleasantly. "There is time for that," he said, "but now I am just getting used to the life here, and starting slowly. We have all the time in the world here, you know?" He smiled. "This place gives you every opportunity for the practice." "It's nice, isn't it?" I turned in the direction of the squeaky voice to face an old, elf-like monk. With a mischievous smile, he grabbed my hand, grandly brushed off my palm, nodded with a jerk over his shoulder at the ordination ceremony, then looked back at my palm. "Your time isn't that far off." I could easily believe him. Although it seemed amazing, considering what my whole life had been, right now I felt the strongest pull in the direction of this monastic life. When I returned to my cave in mid-morning, I was totally exhausted. Just talking with the monks had suddenly called up unused muscles that now cramped. I appreciated the experience of the monks. It gave me a clearer picture of the activities of the wider monastery, its relation to the community of laypeople around it, and its function, not only as a meditation center, but as a school for young monks. My proximity to all of this, however, lessened the solitude that I wanted. The next morning, I mentioned once more to Suno about the hut in the forest I'd been told of on my arrival. He promised me to speak again to Maha Thera, but another day or two went by and still no one approached me. Finally, on the afternoon of the 5th day, instead of remaining in my cave as usual at tea time, I went down to the courtyard. Maha Thera was surprised to see me, and the serious expression on his face became a giggle. Then, closing his eyes and folding his hands, he made a serious face of mock meditation and asked me, without words, how it was all going. With some of the Pāli words I knew, I told him it was going so well I wanted to move to the kuti in the forest. "Ah, yes," his face expressed. Then he sent for Suno for a more literal translation. When Suno arrived, I apologized to him for dragging him from his meditation. "It's quite all right," he politely replied, then listened, chewing thoughtfully on his lower lip as Maha Thera spoke. Apparently, the old head monk felt that my move to the forest was a formidable step, and he wanted to make sure I was ready for it, which is why he had waited for me to come to him. In fact, I had to insist on going and make it clear that I would walk over there by myself if no one would take me. When Mahatera was finally convinced that my decision to go was absolute, he sent a young monk to get the keys. Meanwhile, I returned to my cave, packed up my things, and reappeared on the porch. Incredibly enough, I had to go through the whole routine of asking him all over again before he sent the young monk to lead me to my new home. We walked up a large hill at the rear of the courtyard where the dining hall was, and then along a ridge, passing 2 or 3 other kutis where some old monks lived in relative solitude. Then we followed a long path down into a slight clearing, maybe 50 feet square, in the middle of which sat a stone and plaster hut, with a pitched roof of Spanish-style clay tiles. Inside the white walls it was cool and dark. The single, spacious room contained 2 beds on opposite walls, a good-sized table and chair. The smoothness of the stone floors and the craftsmanship on the wooden windows lent an air of precision rather than rusticity. The young monk showed me the path that led down to the stream, the toilet in the rear of the building, how to work the lamp, and every other detail he thought I would need to know. As soon as the monk left, I set to work sweeping the floor, putting a cloth over the table and setting out my books, laying out the contents of my bag just so on the spare bed, and selecting the proper pillow to sit on for my meditation. When all this was done, the next logical thing to do, it seemed, was to sit, and so after closing the door and the windows, I made myself comfortable atop the bed and closed my eyes. Within a few minutes, I felt the darkness outside blow in like a storm. I could even hear it. In a single instant, as if a curtain had been raised on a new act, the woods were alive and with a whole new set of sounds. The sharp chirping of crickets formed a melodious backdrop to the sudden, violent, crashing sounds of unidentifiable creatures making their way through the night forest that surrounded the clearing on all sides. The screams of monkeys crashing through the trees made me shudder, and the hooting of birds seemed directed right at me. I couldn't distinguish what was inside and what was outside. A scurrying sound, which seemed to be right on the floor in front of me, or even on the bed, caused me to open my eyes. I would look up and shine my flashlight all around the room. I felt like a helpless victim. Human beings were not in control here. In the chaotic free play of nature, I felt as powerful as an insect. Suddenly, walls as a form of protection, as something to shut out all that, seemed desperately important to me. I felt fear well up in my chest. Not simply fear to hide, but the fear that wanted to crush all that activity outside in order to control it. I watched my mind swirl into fantasies of violent death until I leaped up from the bed, ran to the door, and threw it open. It was so dark outside, I couldn't see a foot in front of me. Quickly, I went inside and lit the lamp, but its pale glow dribbled out only a few feet from the door. Beyond was jungle and something else that had no name. It was clear now why Mahatera had insisted that I make this choice. If I had had any doubt at that moment that it was entirely my decision to come to this forest hut alone, if I had had even the remotest thought that someone else had sent me here, it would have been unbearable. As the days went by, though, I got used to it. There was always that moment at the fall of darkness when the panic arose, but after a while I just steeled myself against it and stayed inside the hut until it passed. I didn't have to know the particulars of whatever was going on out there. Still, there were plenty of surprises. One day, just before lunch, I went down to the stream to take my daily bath. This routine was one of the high points of my day. I gathered my bucket, soap, clean clothes, and towel, and gingerly climbed down the steep path that had been carved out of the hill like a tunnel through underbrush and overhanging bamboo trees. At the edge of the water, I walked off on the felled log that spanned the width of the stream, and hopped off in the middle onto a convenient pile of rocks. Standing there, I neatly placed my clothes over a tree trunk and prepared to take my bath. All around me were hills, and upriver the steamy jungle. There was not a soul in sight, just sounds that by now I had gotten used to. The periodic rustling of branches by monkeys, and the buzz of strange insects. Today, though, just as I poured the first bucket over my head, I heard an enormous thump, and then a plop in the water upstream behind me. Turning slowly, I saw the form of a huge prehistoric monster. As I stared at the alligator-like, brown, scaly body with its long, fork-ended tongue whipping the air, my mind grasped for a measure, some standard of distance from my body to the creature's in order to gauge its size. I experienced it as a tiny little inhabitant of the grass, then as an enormous man-eating monster, until my reason settled on some size great enough to call big and frightening. Standing stock still, I watched as it stared at me for a long while, before making its way up out of the water, onto the bank, and then cautiously circling around before dropping into the water again downstream, where it floated away. I was so caught up with my fear and relief that I almost missed the lesson for my living out here alone in the forest. This environment was a constant confrontation with the unfamiliar, and what my mind didn't recognize, it distorted out of fear. A lizard that might have been 6 inches long slithering by me became a prehistoric monster. Ominous footsteps in the night were just mice tripping across the rafters. Where was the reality? The automatic nature of fear was becoming more and more apparent to me. Without control over the environment that makes things familiar, fear overwhelms the mind. I had wanted to civilize this place, to set out my little belongings just so, upon my arrival out here, in order to have a recognizable environment when I walked in the door. I was trying to create some format that my consciousness could recognize, to keep it from trembling before the unknown. And what would happen if I let go of the format? What would happen if I had let my mind go when it faced that lizard? What would that lizard be? Who would I be? After I moved out to the kuti in the forest, over a week went by without my speaking a word to anyone. Twice a day, I would come down to the rear of the monastery and wait off in a corner until food was brought to me. Then I would eat silently and alone, not in the dining hall, but in a room separate from the monks. When I finished, I would walk without pause up and over the hill back to my seclusion. As the days of intense practice wore on, a hollow, uncomplicated space developed around me. I wasn't lonely. I didn't crave the contact of other human beings. I became more and more aware of the quiet that comes from the absence of reverberation. Although my mind wasn't silent, without the presence of other minds to reflect, amplify, and distort it, its processes seemed to untangle, to become clear. Most of the ticker tape it unwound in the long, still hours were messages about my wife. I would be sitting deeply engrossed in some interesting state of concentration, when all of a sudden, as if the needle had been knocked right across the grooves of the record, a new song with haunting lyrics would be playing through my mind, and there I would be, helplessly watching an imagined scene of reunion. The pain that permeated these moments, and sometimes stretched into hours, is difficult to describe. After a while, pain itself became the object of my meditation. It was a pain that was indefinable. That's why it hurt so much. Although the longing of my heart seized upon her as its object, it wasn't her absence that caused the pain, so real that I could often feel a knot in my chest. I was longing for what I could not find within me. I was plunged into some deep, cold, empty space that is the source of all our desires for other beings, but she was the one who had for so long been the focus of my life. Now, absolute solitude made it apparent how much of her I had used to patch that empty space. When I sat absolutely still and silent, I could literally feel my body reaching out to try to grasp whatever it thought it needed for completion. Ego and needs and neurosis were explanations that made no sense to me. As I experienced my being on an incredibly direct level, I didn't understand the whole and the pull. I simply felt them. I felt them more than the tangible raw edge of sensuality, more than the urge for temporary union. I felt what preceded that urge. I felt the emptiness itself, and I could almost touch the painful perimeter of my own incompleteness, the unsatisfied hunger for that which I could not experience within myself and had always sought from others. I touched pain itself, not the situation of pain, nor the object that causes pain, pain itself, the mechanism that infused my being with moment-to-moment suffering, the empty hole called desire. It became very clear that the cause of all the pain was desire. I'm sure that I experienced and even fleetingly understood this before, but now it was more than understanding. It was literal experience. Sometimes the clarity and simplicity of this reality brought tears of understanding. Attachment is suffering. That's all there is. Attachment is suffering. And when my mind played out scenes of my wife, then my whole being suffered. Transmuted to shuddering flesh and grimacing minds, it contorted into harsh forms and rigid dimensions. It lumbered like a clumsy animal in an unfamiliar environment, looking warily over its shoulder, stumbling down dark trails. Her. I felt hands, tongue, and brain reaching greedily, and it was all pure discomfort, pure dis-ease, pure suffering to be that way. There were other times when the attachment eased, when the vision of her and me in some past or future dimension dissolved, and all that was left was some gentle reminder of who she really was, some essence of her that looked as lovely at a distance as it did up close, that had no handles on it, that had no use to me, that existed for appreciation, not part of me or even her. I felt then an enormous outpouring of well-wishing, of true good feelings for her happiness. The feelings were not dependent on what she could give me. It was a real letting go of a being who meant so much to me, which is the basis of real love. And in that love, there was no suffering. Sometimes, when things were going rather well, I would look at myself in the mirror that I carried and laugh. Thinking of my life situation totally amazed me. Most amazing of all was my contentedness with celibacy, since most of my adult years had been spent seeking happiness through the company of women. It used to be that a week without sexual contact was difficult to accomplish. Now, it had been months, and I'd come to understand real celibacy and the false myths of those terribly frustrated men cooped up behind walls. I understood the difference between denial and real celibacy. There is frustration when there's unsatisfied desire, but real celibacy doesn't describe the absence of sexual activity, rather the absence of the desire for it. Celibacy is a state of mind, not body. After my experiences of the past months, it seemed to me a myth that sex is a physical need. My body didn't need it, only because my mind didn't. During all this time, I adhered to a pretty regular schedule, patterned on my stay at the meditation center in Rangoon. By contrast with my schedule, though, there was nothing regular in the routine of my mind. It followed a course that was more like that of a roller coaster. Long, intense spans of high concentration, resulting in cool, airy states of mind, which then dissolved into timeless pits of agitation, of bursting at the seams, unable to focus on anything. After 4 or 5 days of being out in the hut, this state of agitation had gotten to the point where to make it through the hour until my alarm clock, muffled under a pillow, grumbled that the sitting was over, I was required to clench my jaws in a vice-like manner, intertwining my fingertips to keep my arms from flying apart. Finally, one day, as soon as I sat down after lunch, I knew that I wasn't going to make it. About half an hour later, I threw open the door and marched out into the blazing sun. It was too hot to walk outside. I backed off to the narrow concrete walkway that was shielded by the sloping room overhanging the edge of the hut. I must have paced for a full hour before my mind slowed down enough for me to know what I was doing. Regret set in. I had a feeling of intense frustration that after all I had accomplished in Burma, I was back to struggling to sit. As I continued to walk, I became aware of some intruding presence in my mind, which I'd always been aware of, but for the first time seemed foreign, alien. The enormous weight of should felt like sacks of rocks across my shoulders. Should what? Should what? Should sit now. I should be sitting for an hour. For what? And then, as if I'd just opened my eyes and looked around me at this empty clearing in the forest, I think I noticed for the first time that I was really alone. There was no one here to be even aware of my performance, and yet I was insisting on performing anyway. I was insisting that there was some standard, some way to act, some mode of behavior that would be good if I conformed to it. All my life, I was so used to doing it, whatever it was, with my eyes ahead, so used to finishing everything so that it would conform to some expectation, while my attention was really over my shoulder, hoping to catch a hint of how it was going to be received, that I'd carried all that baggage right down here with me. I hadn't been alone yet. There had always been someone else here. Even when there was no one else here, I was still here. I stopped my pacing around the hut. The company of this stranger, I, never seemed more clear and more unnatural. There was no reality to him, and yet he insisted on staying to watch everything I did, to put a seal of approval or disapproval on it. Where did he even come from? There wasn't enough room in my mind-body for us, for this constant war between me doing something and me watching me do it. Why was I afraid to just do it? Because I, wouldn't exist? I didn't know. Slowly, I began walking again, but I didn't go inside to sit, although this was the hour when I should sit. I just walked, and now I walked in silence. My steps made no echo. My mind made no leaps to the next step. I felt incredible freedom from a vice that had always rigidly prescribed each move I made. I had been bound on one side by memory of the past, and on the other by worry of the future. Both conditioned my actions in the present moment, stretched out over that unnatural rack of time I had slowly suffered all these years. But somehow the rack was broken. Each step I took seemed to spring from nothing and dissolve into nothing. Each breath that filled my body as I walked lived and died faster than I could judge it. On a very simple scale, I understood what freedom was. Nothing pushing and nothing pulling. The clock was dead. Without time, nothing could measure me. Nothing could compare me. Each one of my footsteps was uniquely itself, and they led nowhere, only around and around in my empty hut. But somehow, although the hut was empty, I was in it, sitting, and yet outside it, walking. That space that was once too small for both of us now had endless room for none of us, walking, 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 around the empty hut that was full of me. I smiled, then giggled, and then wept with laughter. Eyes and ears were not subtle enough senses for the kind of perception that was occurring. For the first time, perhaps since I'd been born, I knew that I was alive. I knew that I could be... And the blank needed no filling in. Finally, I opened the door and went back into the hut. Hours went by. Interruptions came and went, and I sat and walked and sat and was. The struggle was over. Enormous pain came. Enormous agitation came. But they were events and not misunderstandings. The burden of responsibility for creating my life had been lifted from me by the assurance that life creates itself.
Pariyatti, a nonprofit 501c3 organization, offers a wide variety of books, eBooks, videos, and audiobooks about the teachings of the Buddha, the Pāli language, and Vipassana meditation. Browse our complete catalog at www.pariyatti.org.